Alright, welcome back. In this section, we're going to start our discussion about hexapods. And in this lecture, part 4, we're going to cover some of the more primitive groups of hexapods. The groups we'll be covering in this time are classically referred to as Entognatha, Apterygota, and Paleoptera. But as we'll discuss, these taxa may not necessarily represent monophyletic groupings so much as historical groups into which more basal taxa have kind of been lumped. Alright, so here's that original tree that we started out with, that arthropod family tree, and we are at this point at ring number 8 on this tree, the hexapods. So, subphylum Hexapoda. It is a subphylum of the phylum Arthropoda, and we do believe that the hexapods comprise a single monophyletic group. We believe that there was a single common hexapod ancestor, and all of the rest of the hexapods branched out of that. And this is because we have a number of different traits that are conserved within all hexapods, and we believe these traits to be synapomorphies. These synapomorphic traits that unite all hexapods are the presence of 3 tagmata, a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, and 3 pairs of legs attached to the thorax. Hex actually means 6, and podos again means legs, so hexapod are 6-legged creatures. And that realization that hexapods are monophyletic allows us to build another tree, or a subtree, if you will, and that is the family tree of the hexapods. And right now, we're down here at number 1 on this particular tree, which is the root of the tree, at Hexapoda. And the first set of hexapod taxa that we're going to talk about have classically been grouped under the name Entognatha. And these include the proturans, the diplurans, and the colymbolans. Recently, or fairly recently, their monophyly kind of came into question. And we've done some genetic work on it at this point, and kind of have realized that this Entognatha group is in fact not monophyletic, that it is not a single true natural entity, but in fact that these groups kind of evolved on separate trajectories from the basal hexapod. But for the sake of discussion and understanding, let's talk a little bit about what makes Entognatha's hexapods different from Ectognatha's hexapods. The main difference, as the name suggests, is the positioning of the mouth parts. In Entognatha's hexapods, the mouth parts are actually withdrawn within the head capsule, and they're not out and about, whereas within Ectognatha's hexapods, aka insects, the mouth parts are actually outside of the mouth capsule, or the head capsule. And so the Entognatha's hexapods, as it was traditionally defined, as I said, contain Protura, Colymbola, and Diplura, whereas the Ectognatha's hexapods only contain Insecta, so therefore Ectognatha and Insecta would be synonymous. And the first of these groups that we're going to talk about is the now class Protura. These are sometimes referred to as coneheads. These are very, very small, approximately 1 to 0.5 millimeter long, soil dwellers. They lack eyes, they lack pigmentation, they lack any form of true antennae, although their front legs are modified to be kind of antenniform, and they serve as kind of tactile and sensory organs, like an antenna would. They're what's referred to as ametabolous. We'll get to that in a second. And there are 3 orders. We're not going to go into that. So I mentioned that proturans were ametabolous. And when I say that they're ametabolous, what I mean is that they undergo ametabolous development. That is, they start off as an egg, they hatch out of that egg, and the young look pretty much exactly like the adult, and they get a little bit bigger with each molt until they are the full-blown adult, and they look basically the same as they did when they first hatched out of that egg. The other two types of development that we see more commonly in hexapods, or in the case of these two types in insects, are hemimetabolous development. Sometimes you may have heard of that as referred to as incomplete metamorphosis, and holometabolous development, which you may have heard referred to as complete metamorphosis. In hemimetabolous development, you start off as an egg, the egg hatches out, and it looks sort of like the adult, but not entirely, and you go through a number of what are called nymphal stages, and things like wing pads develop, and then eventually, as you go through the molts, you eventually get to an adult that looks kind of like those nymphs, but not entirely, and it's developed, wings. The third type of insect development is holometabolous development. Again, sometimes referred to as complete metamorphosis. You start out in this type of development as an egg, and you hatch out of that egg as a larva of some kind, a caterpillar or a maggot or something to that effect. And then you go into this stage of quiescence or stillness, referred to as a pupa. Some cases there's an hardened external case to this pupa. In other cases there's not. And then out of this pupa emerges an adult that looks nothing or very little like the larval stage did. So you've gone through a very complete change, or a complete metamorphosis, if you will. And actually, during the pupal stage, the entire structure of the insect pretty much just breaks down to kind of a chemical level and reorganizes itself into this adult. So developmental stages are actually fairly important for defining major insect groups. They're maybe not quite as useful for, identifying a specimen, but they do define major groupings of insects. And these early hexapods that we're going to talk about are primarily ametabolous, though as we get into some of the winged forms, it becomes a hemimetabolous development. So, carrying on with our next class of Entognatha's hexapods is the class Dipleura, or sometimes referred to as the two-pronged bristletails. These guys are also small, a little bit bigger than the last group, but still small, up to 7 millimeters. Soil dwellers. They have what are referred to as caudal filaments. There's 2 of them off of their rear end. In some cases, or in one order, these are modified to a set of pinchers, which are used to capture prey items. These guys are also ametabolous, and it's broken into 2 orders, Rhabdura and Dicellurata, based on whether or not they have those modified caudal filaments that are modified into pinchers. Alright, the final class of Entognatha's hexapods, though also the most diverse class, is the class Collembola, or sometimes referred to as springtails. The class Collembola contains 4 orders: Intobryomorpha, Oduromorpha, Symphypleona, and Nalicpleona. The class Collembola is the only hexapod class with a colophore. And a colophore is an organ for the uptake of water and for excretion. You can actually see it in red on the diagram below. Other features that are common to Collembola are the furcula, which is a forked appendage at the back of the abdomen that's used for jumping. This is actually lost secondarily in some families. And then the retinaculum, which actually is a clasp that holds on to the furcula and releases it and allows these organisms to kind of jump around. These guys are primarily small, a few millimeters in length. There's a couple that get, a little bigger, but not terribly much so. And then they too are ametabolous. Alright, and at this point, we're at ring number 2, Ectonatha, or Insecta. So we've reached the insects at this point. And the first group of insects we're going to talk about is a group that's been classically referred to as Apterygota, or primitive wingless insects. And these contain the orders Microcoryphea and Thysanura. The Apterygota insects lack wings, and their ancestors lack wings. No point in their evolutionary history have they had an ancestor with wings. We haven't made it that far up the insect family tree yet. They have two cerci, a pair of cerci, and a single median caudal filament. The cerci are basically just filaments that are kind of smaller off of the back end. And then they also, at this point, because we've hit Insecta, have external mouthparts, like all insects do. The two orders in this group are Microcoryphea and Thysanura. Microcoryphea, or jumping bristletails, are distinguished from Thysanurans by the fact that they have large contiguous eyes, i.e. they have large eyes that are close together on the head. And they're also kind of more hunchbacked, whereas the Thysanurans tend to be kind of more flattened. Thysanurans, on the other hand, which are sometimes referred to as silverfish or fire brats, have small distal or distantly located on the head eyes, and they also tend to be more dorsoventrally flattened, as I mentioned. But these groups are probably not actually a monophyletic group. Apterygota is probably not monophyletic. And this is based not only on some genetic evidence that we have, but also based on some morphological evidence. Microcorypheans, like diplurans, collembolans, and proturans, have what are called monocondylic mandibles. And that means that there is one condyle, or one ball-like attachment that fixes into the head. Thysanurans, on the other hand, and other higher hexapod orders, have what are called dicondylic mandibles, where there are two condyles that actually fix into the head. And these are thought to potentially separate the Thysanurans from the Microcorypheans, with the Microcorypheans being a lower or more basal, like lower as a term, but more basal group of hexapods. This lends itself as a pretty good point to discuss a little bit about insect morphology, starting out with insect mouthparts, the build of the insect mouth. So the standard insect mouth is composed of a number of parts, going from top to bottom. The labrum kind of serves as an upper lip for the insect mouth cavity, or the insect oral cavity. And it kind of serves to usually hold the food in place. Below that are typically a pair of mandibles. These mandibles are generally there for macerating or chewing, if you will, the food items. Below that are a pair of maxilla, and these are for a little bit for chewing, but also for kind of food handling. And usually they'll have a pair of kind of long extensions on them called maxillary palps. Kind of below and between, kind of in the middle of the oral cavity is the hypopharynx. That should be hypopharynx with a P. And this actually serves to allow for swallowing and stuff like that. It's kind of the entrance to the oral cavity, or to the area behind the oral cavity. And it also contains salivary glands and stuff like that. Kind of separates the chewing from the digestion and all that. And then at the bottom of the insect mouth is the labium, and the labium serves as a couple of purposes. It's kind of a bottom lip, if you will, to kind of close off the bottom of the oral cavity, but it also contains a number or a pair of palps. And these palps are also used for manipulating food within the oral cavity. And insect mouthparts can be modified to a fairly large extent, and depending upon what group you're looking at, these modifications can actually be fairly important for identifying specimens that you may have. So certain groups have or certain orders of insects have piercing or sucking mouth parts, where it's kind of developed into a tube, whereas other groups may have chewing mouth parts or lapping mouth parts. And this mouth morphology can often be useful in determining what your specimen, what order your specimen belongs to. The next topic in our brief foray into insect morphology is the topic of eyes. Adult insects may have up to two types of eyes. The first type of eyes are called compound eyes, and they contain many different facets, or sometimes called ommatidia, and are made up of multiple different lenses. The other type of eyes that insects can have are called simple eyes, and they are a single facet, or sometimes called an ocelli, or an ocellus would be singular. And the number and placement of ocelli can actually be fairly important for identification. Not so much at order level, but when you start getting a little bit below that, it starts becoming a bigger deal a lot. And then the final little aside here is the topic of the insect leg. And the insect leg is made up of 5 parts. From the body outward is the coxa, the trochanter, the femur, the tibia, and then the tarsus. And insect leg morphology varies kind of wildly within insects. And sometimes the exact morphology can make a bit of a difference, or can be useful in identifying things. Alright, coming back to our tree, we're now at ring number 3, Apterygota, or the winged ancestors, or insects with winged ancestors in some cases. Apterygota is another monophyletic group. But the next group that we're going to talk about, which has classically been referred to as Paleoptera, probably isn't a monophyletic group. This grouping, this taxon, sometimes known as the primitive winged insects, contains 2 orders, Ephemeroptera and Odonata. And this classical group of Paleoptera, by the way, means old-winged, or they're the old-winged insects, paleo being old and ptera being wing, were typically grouped together as those insects with wings that could not fold their wings over their backs. They were not articulated to be folded over the back. And the thing that sets us apart at this point that we've gotten to from all of the previous things that we've talked about before is the development of wings. Wings first arose around 350 million years ago, back in the early Carboniferous era. Now, there's a lot we don't really know that well about the evolutionary history of insect wings. We know that in the late Devonian, which followed, or which preceded the Carboniferous era, that we did not see, or we do not see, fossils with wings. We also know that in the later portions of the Carboniferous era, we see multiple different groups with wings. But we don't really have a very good fossil record for this early portion. Also, we don't really know the evolutionary history behind wings that well, or insect wings that well. There are some hypotheses that think that they were really used for either respiratory exchange, that added more surface area for increased gas exchange, or that maybe they were for thermal regulation in some manner originally, or maybe that they were for kind of locomoting around in aquatic systems and kind of moving around a little bit more, kind of like paddles, or maybe that they were actually kind of originally for kind of gliding from a higher point to a lower point when disturbed by a predator. We don't really know where wings came from. We do know that at some point, the Carboniferous era, they kind of were co-opted for flight. So the first order of winged insects that we're going to talk about are the Ephemeropterans, or mayflies. And the order Ephemeroptera is characterized by two pairs of membranous triangular wings in adults. These wings are held upright over the back when these mayflies are at rest. Usually mayflies will have three caudal filaments. The median or the middle one is occasionally reduced, so it looks like two. And they also have only a single tarsal claw at the end of the leg, so only one claw at the very tip of every leg. And now we've gotten out of the ametabolous orders and into the hemimetabolous orders. And then the last order we're going to talk about, which is the second order in this group, Paleoptera, is the order Odonata, which is dragonflies and damselflies. Most people are fairly familiar with what odonates look like. Most people have seen dragonflies before at some point. But to describe them, they have two pairs of membranous wings, a forewing and a hindwing. They tend to be kind of more elongate and almost teardrop shaped, whereas the Ephemeropterans are triangular. They have an elongate abdomen as adults, and then large eyes. They're actually visual predators. They're very fast moving and will actually grab other insects just out of the air. It's kind of impressive to watch. And then they too are hemimetabolous. They have a incomplete metamorphosis. They go through nymphal stages. And this brings us to ring number 4 on our tree, Neoptera, or the new wings, which means insects with wings that can be folded flat over their back. And we'll discuss this group, or get into this group, in the next lecture. But before we go, let's have a brief discussion on the issue of monophyly of Paleoptera, which probably the answer short is that it's not monophyletic. Paleoptera is sometimes referred to as a wastebasket taxon, and this brings us all the way back to that first part 0 talk that we had, to the concepts of synapomorphy and plesiomorphy. So with Neoptera, the fact that the Neopterans, the new winged insects, can fold their wings over their back, that is a synapomorphy for that group. It's actually a monophyletic group. But the not being able to fold the wings over the back is not necessarily a synapomorphy for Paleoptera. In fact, we think it's the ancestral state. It makes it a plesiomorphy. And plesiomorphies, unlike synapomorphies, don't tell us things about taxa, or the relationships between taxa. They only tell us what the ancestral state was and can set aside other things as synapomorphies. So, in short, it would seem that Paleoptera is paraphyletic.